Welcome, everybody, to Conflicts of Interest. I'm the co host of the show, Kyle Anslone. I'm joined by the other co host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
I'm good, Kyle. How you doing, man? I know you're kind of a little bit got a scratchy throat, a little under the weather.
Yeah, well, it's been a busy week. I finally made it to my final destination in my new apartment for the move. I made it about, I think 2/3 away across the country from,
Damn.
Boston to the Denver area now. So it's been a hell of a week, but I took the time to try to get one last show out for the week with you here, Will, especially because we have a couple interesting stories here, especially this first one where you have
Yeah.
an interesting amount of detail. So, other than telling people to subscribe to the YouTube channel and all the different feeds, podcast feeds, and giving the show ratings and reviews, Will, why don't we just jump in right here and talk about this kidnapping plot against your esteemed governor, Whitmer?
Yeah. So we were just talking about Whitmer on the last episode about her the state Supreme Court decision shooting striking down her COVID orders, and that kind of has some relation here in just terms of her the amount of power she's aggrandized to herself. That is what these you mentioned that there was a kidnapping plot that the FBI claims to have unraveled, and that is sort of what these guys were so angry about is a lot of her COVID powers. They wanted to kidnap her and try her for treason. Um, so they hit six guys with federal charges in this whole thing. There's more people involved in that, but the six were hit with the federal charges. Five of them were from Michigan. One of them was from Delaware. But before I get into the story a little more, I will say I actually know one of these guys personally. You kind of hinted at that. One the guy Caleb Franks in the you can read the FBI affidavit. They mention him by name. I knew this person. He lived down the street from me. I knew his older brother, and hung out with him quite a bit. Unfortunately, his older brother has now passed away from an overdose. But I had a lot of personal interaction with this Caleb Franks guy. At the time, he wasn't really into politics or anything. This is a couple of years ago that I was associating with him. I never really heard him talk about any kind of militia stuff or anything. I think I did see him wearing like a biker jacket before, so he's kind of in that scene. But again, I didn't get any impression from him that he was going to be a future, he would later be wrapped up in some kind of kidnapping plot like this. So
Yeah,
that's just a. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, Will, as far as we know, are these all still allegations from the FBI, or is there any video of, these guys put out like a YouTube, a video being like, we're going to kidnap the governor? And just to clarify, because the headlines, make it sound like this was like a kidnap murder plot kind of thing. It sounds the way you're describing it more, they had planned to make something of a citizen's arrest, which against the governor of a state obviously isn't something that is ever going to be allowed to happen. But it's not like they were going to take her and murder her and hang her up in the town square or something like that.
Well, there's some discrepancy because if you read through the FBI affidavit, they are relying on some confidential informants. They had two confidential informants they sent in there, and they also had two undercover FBI agents who were working in this plot. That's part of how they busted it. And honestly, like before I even read the story, I was like, I assumed that that was the case, that this was based on informants and stuff. However, it's not. Like they also claim that like these guys went on Facebook live streams and did talk about this stuff occasionally. So it's not just based on the word of these informants. However, I didn't see the actual live stream in question, but they are claiming that there was some stuff in the public record that these guys were talking about this. Um, but anyway, the idea I get of these guys, they're kind of something between like Boogaloo Boys and preppers and some kind of right-wing militia libertarian-ish leaning guys. I didn't get any specific idea of like their ideology or anything, but they definitely seem to be like in that orbit. One of them one of the guys has videos where he's got an anarchist flag on the wall. I think he identified as an anarchist, like our type of anarchist, not like a ANCOM or a syndicalist or anything. So that's like the type of guys we were dealing with here. But to get to just like the FBI narrative of what happened here. Originally, they say there was two guys who they saw talking on social media about like overthrowing various state governments because they were like you mentioned sort of in a citizen's arrest kind of sense that like these places are violating the Constitution and we want to restore the rule of law to America and all this stuff. And so that was sort of their approach. But the first two guys who were talking about this on social media, they gathered a group of dudes to meet in Ohio. And in that very first meeting, the FBI had an undercover informant there, a confidential informant infiltrating the group. So pretty much right from the beginning, they had feds in this thing. Um, And at some point, these guys tried to link up with another militia group, like an actual established group, to try to get them in on their plans. I guess they wanted guys with guns and more people to participate in this. However, the FBI had already been looking at that militia group too, and already had a confidential informant in that group as well. So now we have two groups linking up, and they have feds surveilling both of them basically. So this whole thing was pretty much doomed from the start. And actually, in the FBI affidavit, they mentioned that they paid one of the informants $8,600, $8,600. They paid the other one $14,800. Like, that's like pretty big money, I think, for confidential informants. And they don't really say what that's for. They just say it's for expenses. So make of that what you will. But handing out some pretty big amounts of money to these guys. So these dudes start talking about how they need 200 men to storm the capital of Michigan in Lansing, and they're going to capture Whitmer and do the citizen's arrest and try her for treason. And they wanted to do all that before the election in November. So like they were imminently, apparently, so the FBI says, planning to do this like soon. And that they were discussing that in like June. So they had a couple months of time to plan this. But anyway, they later downgraded this plan, apparently. Like you read the FBI affidavit, they say they decided the storming the Capitol is maybe a little too ambitious. And they decided they were going to try to go and capture Whitmer at her vacation home, which apparently they did go and surveil the vacation home. So they were at least sort of serious in that regard. They actually went and found the place and like, again, this is all according to what the FBI claims. But some of these things, I don't think they would just outright lie about some of these basic details. Where I think they might lie is like there are some weird discrepancies in the affidavit. So at various points, they do suggest that some members were like kind of reluctant to do all this stuff. Like they're reluctant to even do the vacation home thing, not only the Capitol, storming the Capitol. And on some occasions, it seemed like the guys only wanted to do property damage. Yet on other occasions, they talk about killing Whitmer. Like they talk about shooting her and killing her with a bomb and all this stuff. So like it's not totally clear when these guys are just BSing and when it's just tough talk and how serious they really were about some of the stuff they were saying. But apparently they did go and surveil her vacation home. So that is, make of that what you will.
Yeah. So can I just jump in real quick and ask, because I think it's in line with all this. You mentioned that there's 2 FBI agents and 2 FBI informants that are involved with this group. In the past, we've talked about especially young Muslim men being entrapped by the FBI in some way, either using informants or FBI undercover agents, essentially baiting them into kinds of terrorism plots and then busting the plots. And at times, I think we've talked in the past on the show about particular stories where the target of the entrapment was at times hesitant to go through with the plot. It was either the FBI informants or the FBI agents that pushed them and were like, no, you gotta do this, you said you were gonna do it, you're committed to it. There's even like one story where the guy like couldn't get a babysitter for his kid, so he brought his kid to one of these meetings with the FBI agents. And like the FBI was like, you need to buy like nails and a trigger from the local hardware store, and he couldn't come up with the $15 to buy this stuff. So the FBI agent literally had to give it to him, give him right to the hardware store. He goes in and buys the stuff like that. And so, do we have any idea of who is is it a particular person who's not either an FBI informant or FBI agent pushing this, or is it possible, especially with the large payments, let's say if you're an FBI informant, so far they've given you $7,000 and they're saying like, hey, you need to get more, would it be then, maybe advantageous to drum something up a little bit, like, hey, maybe we should look at the vacation home, and people are getting cold feet about the Capitol, stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, you get the idea based on what the FBI is saying that there's the one guy, Adam Fox, was like sort of the most gung ho about this, and we don't have any they don't say that he is the confidential informant. They of course don't name them, but I think they make it clear that like the CIs are separate from this Adam Fox guy. So there was at least one guy in the group who seemed to be kind of gung ho about it, but yeah, you do have other members of the group saying like they're not so sure. In fact, the guy that I know, Caleb Franks, they actually specifically say that he had misgivings about it, that he actually left. Like there was they were training up in like rural Michigan. He actually left that property after they'd started talking about kidnapping because apparently he was not cool with it. And so it's not very clear who which of the guys were totally on board with this. And I'm curious too because they do talk about how they raised money to purchase a $4,000 night vision goggle set, like a really professional type. And I'm curious if some of that confidential informant money, if some of those expenses they're talking about was indeed to buy that night vision goggles and to sort of help this plan go forward. Because they might have said like, well, if we're going to do the surveillance, the reconnaissance, we need night vision goggles. And the CI goes, okay, I'll buy it. And then the FBI ends up reimbursing that. So I'm not totally sure. Again, this is all based on just the FBI's story. So they're of course not going to say that like, oh yeah, our confidential informants were pushing this whole plot and like it was all, all the other guys didn't want to do it. But there are just some weird indications you get that like the FBI, even in their side of things, they do say that there's like some reluctance with some of these members.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's at least important details in the case of like the person you know personally here. Maybe there was this one guy, as you point out, who was a big driver of it, but what were his particular capabilities to make this happen? If without the FBI informants, dumping money involved, possibly, I don't, just everything we know about how the FBI gets involved in these cases. I appreciate that your reporting of it has been so skeptical, just because, that's my natural kind of inclination now, is to be, possible entrapment, because so often it seems that, and look, as you point out, the FBI already had an informant in this other group. They're loaded up in these kind of groups and organizations. One of the interesting things about like learning about the Oklahoma City bombing is just how many of the different alleged white supremacists actually seem to have been ATF or informants of different government agencies, and
Yeah,
and so
Andre
they're
Strassmeyer and all that.
right, right. I believe even like there was a woman that was an ATF informant who was involved in Elohim City and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Richard Booth is, by the way, doing great work on this over at the Libertarian Institute. If you look up, he has a whole archive of like every Oklahoma City document put together and really well organized. But he's also doing a
Yeah.
bunch of great writing on it as well. So be sure to check that out. But back to this Whitner thing, Will. I guess, did you get the impression that they were maybe ever well enough organized to actually pull this off? Or was it, for some people, maybe more of a LARPing thing, just hanging out with, other people interested, people really upset about the lockdowns? Or was it like, they were like ready to pull the trigger and go on this, and it was only the FBI announcing this indictment and rounding up these people that kept at least a few of them from launching a half-assed plot to, like, get the governor somehow, or set fire to a property? You saw a little bit about property damage, something like that.
Yeah, it's not really, it doesn't seem like these guys were really like cutthroat, like really prepared to carry out this kind of operation. Some of like the quotes that are in the affidavit, or like the way these guys talk, are just like they sound very unprofessional and kind of just like, stupid kids kind of. Like Caleb, the guy that I knew, was only a year younger than me. I think he's like 26, so he's not like a teenager or something. But still, it was mostly like a lot of young dudes who didn't seem to have like military experience, anything that would really make them capable for this type of plot. There were a couple older guys, and they were hanging out with some of these militia dudes, so maybe those guys were a little more gung ho about it. But at least the people driving the plot, like that Adam Fox guy, they seem kind of incompetent. Doesn't seem like they were really prepared to do this kind of thing.
Right. So I guess the part of this story that I found really interesting is just why it happened, and it's because of the lockdowns and how many lives have been ruined. And I think Michigan has maybe been one of the states hit harder by the lockdowns than any other. You
Yeah.
seem to have had stricter restrictions. Uh, I felt like, from talking to you, almost than what I was going through, like in the Boston area. Massachusetts is a very liberal state. Boston, a very liberal town. I actually talked to a friend of mine who was helping out a family business that's based in Michigan, and he was telling me about all the struggles they have for several months. Apparently, there was really like they did like construction work installing some kind of windows, and he was saying essentially there was like no reason that they couldn't send like two people from one company to the job site when nobody else was there and install these windows. But the way the executive orders came out, they were essentially threatened with like $1,000 fine every day that they sent anybody to the work site. And so they, had to lay off a bunch of employees that they actually had like work to give out. And, I'm sure that's just one story of thousands of people in Michigan who have had their lives turned upside down or ruined by these lockdowns.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in my own personal case, just like from my own vantage point, I've been very fortunate. I work from home. I work remotely, and my employer is in a foreign country, so we're not really, I haven't really been too imposed upon by some of these restrictions. I live in a fairly small, like ruralish town as well, so like I haven't really seen like a lot of like the worst of the impact of the lockdowns. But just like reading about and seeing what's in the executive orders, I mentioned on our last episode how Whitmer tried to ban just like going to other people's private residences. Like you can't go visit another person's house. Like that was like the level of the lockdowns that she was trying to enforce. And yeah, I imagine that people, especially in the more like metropolitan areas around Detroit, really were hit hard with this and ruined their livelihoods and stuff. And yeah, this is sort of, it seems like this whole kidnapping plot is kind of like a unintended side effect of that, is that you're going to piss off some people so much that like they might start talking about doing this kind of thing. And they weren't only mad at Whitmer; they're mad at several state governments for violating the Constitution and all that stuff. And which you and I know, we've talked about this plenty. The U.S. government and state governments, local governments don't give a damn about the Constitution. But with this COVID stuff, it's been particularly bad, where they're really like shutting down private, visiting your friend and shutting down public gatherings and not letting people work and all that. That's going to get people mad.
Right. Well, is there any other aspects of the story that I didn't ask you about that you think are important, or anything else we should talk about before we move on?
I'll just mention that like the charges these guys were brought up on was conspiracy to kidnap, and they did not find any when they were eventually busted. These guys were arrested. They hadn't done anything but talk about this. Basically, that's what the crime they committed was talking about doing this. There were other people who were charged under state charges for several other things like gang membership and aid to terrorism and other stuff, but you don't hear about them in the FBI's version of events because that's not who they're charging. So I think more information on those guys will probably come out soon. It might even be already out now. I haven't looked too hard into the state charges.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll update this, especially if there's anything in this story regarding the FBI informants and how the role that they end up playing there, because I'm always particularly interested in that. But let's take a second to talk about our sponsor, Paloma Verde CBD. Will, I've definitely been enjoying my CBD products as I've moved across the country here. Of course, it's screwed up my sleep schedule, and spending so much time driving in the car has not been friendly on my back. I've been taking a couple of the gel capsules every day, and feeling pretty good about it. And for the most part, making the shows, and we haven't really had any comfortable seating at my apartment, but I still feel pretty good. And I think at least part of that is the CBD helping with the inflammation in my back, and helping me to unwind after drinking massive amounts of caffeine to help me drive across the country. And so, anyways, I really recommend everybody check out Paloma Verde CBD and see if CBD products can in some way benefit your life. The website has a great CBD education tab to tell you kind of everything that CBD can do for you and how it works. You can also check out the lab results on the website to make sure that the products you're getting from Paloma Verde are safe and have the right amount of dosage and everything like that. So that it's going to work for the same for you every time. It's not like when you go to the head shop and get yourself 10 gummy worms and one of them doesn't do anything, and then the next one seems like it has a truckload of CBD in it. So be sure to check out palomaverdestore.com. That's palomaverdestore.com. And once you're there, you use the promo code PEACE for 25% off orders of $75 or more. Will, let's get back to the show.
All right, let's do it.
Next up, we have Trump putting out a tweet that really didn't expect to see. And his tweet said, "We should have the small remaining number of our brave men and women serving in Afghanistan home by Christmas." I assume he means Christmas of 2020, Will. Although, he could revise it later to be like he meant Christmas of 2024 as he's rounding out his last term in office or something like that. But no, really, assuming he means that, this sounds like great news. And there's about 2,500 soldiers in Afghanistan. And that's the numbers that, we think that we know. If, there's a bunch of special operation guys running around that don't get counted in that, or the troops at the embassy, the number could be, 3,000, 3,500. Who knows, what this is going to mean for the number of U.S. contractors in Afghanistan. But at the same time, this sounds like maybe Trump is planning on really pulling out of Afghanistan and closing the Bagram Air Base. So, Will, what were your thoughts on this story?
Yeah, it's interesting. He's actually said this like multiple times now. Whether he said he's in the tweet, he said by Christmas, and he also said in another case by the end of the year. But either way, that's much earlier than like the spring 2021 deadline that's laid out in the deal that the U.S. signed with the Taliban in February. So this is like interesting, and it kind of did just come right out of the blue. And people can see the tweet if they're watching the video. What he said there. He said it kind of weirdly though. He said that the remaining U.S. forces in Afghanistan should be home by Christmas. So like it wasn't really clear if he was just like expressing an opinion personally, like it's if only he had some kind of power to do something about that. He's only the president of the country, but it wasn't clear if he was just like voicing an opinion or whether this is like a shift in policy or what, which I guess is kind of typical of Donald Trump's tweets. And I wouldn't have really taken it that seriously if it was just this one tweet. However, he came out the next day on Thursday and he said this again in a Fox News interview, where this time he was saying it like way more directly, like something he's going to do. That it was something like, "I'll have the 4,500 troops home by the end of the year." So like he was way more direct in that second appearance. And the weird thing about this is like the timing of this, like right around like just hours before he sent that initial tweet, his own national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, came out and like gave the next step for what the withdrawal would be under like the timetable that we thought was in place before. That he said they were going to go down from 4,500 to 2,500 by early 2021. So like Trump like almost came out and contradicted him immediately, or at least appeared to. And like definitely appeared to after that Fox News interview where he is saying, "I will have those 4,500 troops home." And it's kind of weird. There's kind of a like dispute over how many troops are actually in Afghanistan right now. Because O'Brien, when he came out and did that comment before the Trump tweet, he said that like as of today, we're now at under 45, or under 5,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. Yet I had also read a story from the Associated Press citing U.S. officials saying that is not going to happen until next month, until November, which is kind of what we thought was going to happen. Like previously, they were saying that we'd be down to under 5,000 troops by November. And then O'Brien was saying that by early 2021, that will be down to 2,500. And so there's sort of like some dispute over like how many soldiers are actually there right now. But nonetheless, there are a few stories out right now suggesting that the Pentagon and the State Department are like completely confused and baffled about what Trump is saying here about leaving by Christmas. Like they don't know, they haven't heard of any orders or any plans for that to happen. And then Task and Purpose also had a story where they're citing DoD officials who won't give like a straight answer on whether this is actually happening. And so it's not really clear what the hell is going on right now with the U.S. forces in Afghanistan, what's going to happen. But Trump has been playing this up. He said this multiple times that we're have a complete withdrawal by the end of the year. And so, that's very interesting. Again, I was pretty much ready to dismiss it after that first tweet. Like, this is just Trump talking off the cuff. But now that he said it a couple times, it's starting to like, I'm wondering if he is going to try to push this through as some kind of like last minute campaign maneuver, which it clearly would be that, attempt to boost his campaign right at the last minute. But I don't care what reason he gives for it. Like, I just want to see him leave. We just celebrated our 19th anniversary in this war this week. And I would be, elated to see him take off and just leave, just cut and run by the end of the year.
Right. Well, thanks for clearing up the troop numbers, because I thought 2,500 was where we were already at, but we're still between 4,000 and 5,000. And the 2,500 was like the official end of the year number, as you point out, like support by even what seems to be the more blob type people in the Trump administration, like NSA Robert O'Brien. I will say I find the the denials of we haven't heard anything about this from like the State Department and the Pentagon to be interesting, just because that's what happens every time Trump suggests doing anything that involves withdrawing any troops from anywhere or in any way reducing the amount like of U.S. intervention overseas. Is they had shot like, how could we have ever anticipated something like this? And we just had no idea. And who knows what the president is tweeting, but trust us, the actual people in charge here are going to make sure that nothing crazy happens. And this seems to just be another example of, kind of Trump having some great tendencies, right? Like if he actually would be planning to bring U.S. troops home by Christmas, that's great. But he doesn't have the personnel in the right places and doesn't have the wherewithal to make it happen. And I think I saw recently Trump tweeted out something about we're not working on the stimulus, but I want Mitch McConnell to push through the Supreme Court justice nomination, to
Yeah.
replace RBG. When really, if Donald Trump wants something like this done, what he should be doing is pushing Mitch McConnell to approve his nominee to Afghanistan, Will Ruger, who could help to facilitate Trump's policy of ending the war, because we know that Will Ruger is a real believer in getting U.S. troops out of Afghanistan. But
Yeah.
again, it doesn't seem Trump has like the ability to see the picture in that big of a sense to be able to make that happen, is rather just sending out another tweet that, hey, again, if he can make it happen, fantastic, I support it. But my guess is that we're going to have several thousand troops still in Afghanistan come Christmas.
Yeah, unfortunately, I get the same exact feeling. Like, I kind of get the idea Trump might just be doing this as sort of a last gambit for his campaign. You know that like even if it were done by Christmas, that's still after the election. So like he doesn't actually have to do anything before November. So he could easily just be like holding this out as some kind of bait to get people to vote for him, and he doesn't actually intend to make that happen. And even if he did, I think you're right that there's a good chance that his personnel would stop him because he's a dummy. He hires all the wrong people who won't carry out his own vision and agenda. Which to whatever extent he has one vision or agenda, at least these like some of these impulses of bringing U.S. troops home, he does not have the right people in the right places to make that happen. So I think you're right about that.
He made a little bit of other foreign policy, interesting foreign policy news, just a couple, probably a day before we recorded here on the Rush Limbaugh show, where Trump finally dropped a bomb that actually offended the mainstream media. Of course, I'm talking about the F bomb, where Donald Trump said, if Iran is effing with us, we will punish
F with
them
them.
like we've never punished them before. His very typical kind of thing that he says about North Korea or Venezuela or Russia or China. This, we will get them like they've never been gotten before, and they will regret ever doing anything ever. And it's just incredible that the criticism of Donald Trump for 4 years in the U.S. has been he's brutish, he's racist, he's inhumane, he doesn't care about human life. And if you look at his foreign policy, that's reflective in it. He has starved Yemeni children to death, Iranians have suffered, Venezuelans have suffered, Syrians have suffered. These massive sanctions campaigns, scores of civilians in Syria, Iraq, Somalia have been on the receiving ends of U.S. drone strikes or different kinds of air strikes, and have been blown to pieces. He dropped a Moab on Afghanistan for no reason. The Iron Tempest campaign that we've documented and talked about, his drug war there, killed hundreds of innocent people. The war in Yemen is absolutely the worst thing, and we detailed the crisis there and the U.S. role in it. But all of these things have just been horrific. And yet, whenever he does something like bomb Assad, that's when you have Brian Williams in the mainstream media saying that Trump is at his most presidential. And yet, it's when he says something like this, which, as ugly as Trump's Iran policy has been, this doesn't even, this F bomb doesn't come close to the true devastation of it. I mean, he's ramped up sanctions against Iran as the country was suffering one of the worst in the world from the COVID pandemic. So I don't know. That seems to me to should be a whole lot more offensive to people than just saying the F word. But that's where we're at in discourse. Where if you dismember an entire bus full of Yemeni children, that's just not as big of a deal as saying the F word on public radio in the U.S.
Yeah, it's like a perfect encapsulation of like the establishment like stance and take on Donald Trump. It's like, yeah, we don't care how many, we don't care how deep your, rivers of blood and piles of corpses are, but if you say a bad word or talk mean or so, say mean things, that's what we're really upset about, and that's what that's the moral issue of our time, and this is the most important election of our whole lifetime, and all this. That's how they're gonna, that's their approach to all this. And I guess it makes sense, because like there are rivers of blood and piles of corpses on every presidency, and so it's just like that's the foreign policy consensus. But hey, if you're going to be uncouth and say like Barack Obama wouldn't do that, Bush wouldn't really, he wouldn't say the F word on the radio. So I don't know, like that's where we're at with the like you're saying with the discourse.
Right. Yeah, I guess the big problem is that all these policies of Trump here indict also Obama and Bush and the rest of them, and
Right.
in a way to a far greater extent. Just Obama expanded all those wars and started them, and Trump has continued bombing Somalia and stuff like that. But at the same time, at least he didn't overthrow Gaddafi. He didn't
Right.
start bombing Syria. He didn't run the Timber Sycamore program to increase ISIS and the caliphate in Syria. And so if you're going to bring all this up, you're going to hurt the, Nobel Prize winning Barack Obama's reputation. And so that's just not acceptable, even though, again, if you want to look at racist policies that kill brown children, the wars do the most. But maybe
Right.
we should move on here and talk about the last story we have, which is from Aaron Mate at the Gray Zone. He says the ex OPCW chief Jose Bustani, I think is how you say his name. I believe he's
Yeah.
Brazilian. Reads Syria
Yeah. That's right.
testimony that U.S., UK, and I believe France also blocked at the UN. And again, this is, I believe, the first director general of the OPCW. He's been the subject, at least of foreign policy focused shows in the past, just discussing, the OPCW and how even in the early days, the Bush administration and John Bolton bullied this guy, including threatening his children to try to help facilitate starting the war against Iraq, the second Iraq war there. And so, Will, what did you find interesting about this? I guess talk a little bit about being blocked, and then we could talk about the statement itself.
Yeah, yeah. The first thing I'll say is just this story was completely ignored in the corporate press. And like, people often say that kind of stuff, but like, I often see people saying that and they're like sharing a link to MSNBC. They're like, this story is never covered in the mainstream. It's like, well, what, I don't know, what's that you're sharing there? But no, if you actually look this up, plug Jose Bustani into like Google News or something, it pulls up like RT stories and the Gray Zone and TASS, the Russian outlet. So that's kind of weird. Usually, Google News serves you up like all the corporate mainstream coverage, and there's virtually none. Like nobody is writing about this block testimony. And as you're saying, this week, the first head of the OPCW, the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog, which kind of like partners up with the UN to do these inspections and stuff, he was blocked from testifying at the UN Security Council, where he wanted to discuss the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma, Syria, in 2018, which you and I have covered extensively on your old show, Foreign Policy Focus. But the U.S. basically, like right at the last minute before this guy wanted to testify, the U.S. Ambassador to the UN and the U.K. and France and several other U.S. allies like objected to him testifying because they said that his testimony won't be relevant because he was the head of the organization too long ago and that like he won't have any relevant insight on what happened in Douma, which I find to be a preposterous thing because like when you actually get to his testimony, which they didn't let him say, but when you read it, it was very relevant. He did have relevant things to say about Douma, I think. But maybe just to swing back a little bit and just explain what happened with the Douma thing, the chemical weapons attack. That was the whole thing he wanted to testify about. We've covered it a ton on your old show, but generally we are skeptical of what Western governments have claimed about what happened there in Syria. First and foremost, or not foremost, but just firstly, because of how quickly they rushed to their certain conclusion that the Syrian government must have used chlorine gas on these civilians during this thing in April 2018. Even though there was quite a few reasons to go against that, like that would not have been your first assumption. Yet that is what the governments were they were leaping to that conclusion. Like Assad at the time, Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, he had a clear upper hand in the war. So it didn't really make sense for him to use chemical weapons in that way. And especially when he knew that doing so could easily trigger Western or outside intervention, as it actually did. Or like, at least on the basis of the allegation that he used chemical weapons. Because the U.S. and France and the U.K. bombed Syria in retaliation for this. When they accused him of this chemical attack, they bombed several facilities, which actually I've shown in my own reporting that the U.S. lied about what they actually bombed in those strikes. They claimed they were chemical weapons like production facilities, and that's not the case. The OPCW had inspected those buildings and cleared them for any evidence of chemical weapons work. So that's like one hole in the U.S. story. However, the main reason I think to be skeptical of what's been said about the Douma stuff with the chemical weapons is that 3 or 4 OPCW whistleblowers have come forward to say that the organization's like fact-finding reports on Douma were screwed up, that they were heavily edited to leave out a bunch of very critical evidence, and also dissenting views from inspectors on the ground. Like the fact that like the level of chlorine found at some of these sites was like in a very minute concentration that didn't indicate a chemical weapon attack. Or like how 4 different NATO experts had concluded that victims of this alleged attack didn't show any symptoms of like suffering from a chemical weapon, like whether it was chlorine or anything else. There was also a claim about a gas canister found inside a house that was alleged to have been dropped from a government aircraft through like the roof of the building. But there's this OPCW engineering assessment that they left out of their public reporting that like very much challenges that idea and suggests that maybe somebody planted it there. That like they're looking at like the physics and like the damage to the canister, and they're like, this doesn't look like it crashed through the ceiling. So there's a lot of reasons to be skeptical of what the OPCW has claimed in its reports about Douma, and we've had various insiders come out and dispute key parts of this narrative. So that's sort of what Bustani wanted to address in his testimony, that he wanted to just to talk about this. But he fortunately released his full testimony in a video, so like we do know what he said. And also the Russian ambassador to the UN actually read it into the public record after Bustani was blocked from speaking. So that was kind of a good move too. But he basically just said that like there's he's seen the evidence from these OPCW whistleblowers, and that he's convinced that it at the very least shows some kind of questionable conduct from top people at the organization. But he also says it could show like fraudulent conduct, that like they straight up lied about this, which is pretty consequential. An international chemical weapons watchdog lying about an alleged chemical attack that then justified, Western military intervention. That's like a big deal. And that's something that Aaron Mate has, he's made that point multiple times too. That was sort of like the main push of Bustani's testimony, was just that he's seen this evidence and he agrees that it's like alarming, that this does show like the OPCW needs to address this. And he said they have not been transparent in like, speaking to these concerns. They basically tried to come out and attack the whistleblowers as like, they weren't that involved in the organization and they didn't have good reputations. But there's a lot of documentary evidence that's just not true, that these guys had the best exemplary reputations in the organization. And there's no reason that like they shouldn't be listened to. They're not cranks. They're not like fringe people. They're very well respected people within the OPCW. So it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Well, let's just mention the story that the MSNBC, the mainstream media, MSNBC, whoever, could be running with here, where right after an alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma, Trump, without investigating, looking into it, immediately bombs Assad. And, as it's come out later, it's shown that the U.S. has really tried to influence the OPCW, this international watchdog group, into coming to the conclusions that support that bombing. That sounds like a real scandal to me. And a real easy one to like have people understand. And yet, again, I believe this is the moment that Brian Williams said Trump has become presidential, right? Or was that right after Khan Sheikhoun? One or the other. Saying, Trump has become presidential for bombing Syria. And even if we're talking about Khan Sheikhoun, same problem, false allegations of chemical weapons attacks leads to U.S. strikes in Syria. So it's just, I don't know what commentary I was going with, other than it's just baffling that they don't seem to care about this story, which fits well within the, Orange Man bad narrative.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of like makes my spidey senses tingle a little bit. Like when you see like a easy, like, home run scandal that they could hit with Trump with, they're constantly trying to hit him with nonsense about like, based on just like anonymous claims and all this crap. Here we have like whistleblowers, we have like documentary evidence, we have really good reason to believe there was some kind of scandal here. And nothing, like not only nothing, it's if you talk about this, you're like a freak, conspiracy kook, Russian agent or something. That's like the mainstream take on it. Mm-hmm. And that should give you pause a little bit, that like, why is that the case? Why can't I don't know, why would it be that you can't challenge the OPCW or question their findings or whatever? And it just seems like they are part of this sort of like international network that does, it's sort of like it's very gangster like. The way they use these international organizations to justify mass violence on other societies it's like they know that like that's part of the game and you can't touch that. You can't go after the OPCW because that's like our, our golden thing to use to invade other countries. We can't call that into question. It does make you just, I don't know, I don't want to be too conspiratorial about it that they're all on this, they're all part of some cabal that are protecting this organization.
New World
But it does
Order.
just the Illuminati teaming up here. But it does just seem like there is some sort of consensus that like there's certain places they just won't go. They will not challenge something that could, call into question the credibility of the OPCW because that's part of like the liberal international order and all this stuff that you can't question.
Right. And again, even when it just seems like it would fit the narrative so well, and you have
Yeah,
multiple people from the OPCW, we have the former and first head of it here, but again, the esteemed Ian Henderson, and then the other whistleblower known as Alex have extensive careers at the OPCW. I mean, look at the martyr they made of Alexander Vindman. I mean, these guys have far
yeah,
better records and are far more important and did actual science, right? That like prove things. Ian Henderson's engineering reports are
right.
just scientific that proves that this attack wasn't what they said it was. And yet, why cover it? It doesn't. I mean, you even had like Aaron Mate actually, I believe, testified at the UN about this, and I hardly saw any coverage of that.
Me either. It
Essentially,
was
it's
excellent.
like,
It was really great.
you know,
So good.
the Gray Zone, Caitlin Johnstone, the Ron Paul Institute, antiwar.com, and then RT being like the most mainstream media site that will even touch these kind of stories. And
Right.
really, that's it. It's you're not going to find it, or if you do, it's going to be maybe a very short write up at a newswire site that gets republished at like NBC or something. They just will
Right. And something
republish the
very
Reuters thing, but it's always very vague and
dismissive, kind of. Yeah.
yeah. Anything else on this, Will?
No, I did intend to mention how Bustani had been sort of pressured out of his position at the OPCW, but you already mentioned that the crazy thing about John Bolton threatening his children, saying that like because the whole thing was like he wanted to Saddam Hussein right after 9/11 wanted to join the Chemical Weapons Convention, which is like the what the founding document of the OPCW. That's like their main thing. And the U.S. was not down with that. And this was when Bustani was the head of the organization, and he was down to go through with this. He wanted to send inspectors to Iraq to make sure they had destroyed their stockpiles. And Bolton and the U.S. did not want that to happen. So they sticked John Bolton on him, where he said like, we know where your sons live, that you have two sons in New York. And that story has been like at least sort of semi corroborated by like former coworkers of Bustani and family members who said that like, yeah, he talked about that at the time. This is not something he just made up later or something. Like he definitely told his close acquaintances that like John Bolton threatened my children. And so like there is pretty good reason to expect that happen. Not to mention Bustani is a well-respected guy. He's been after he was the OPCW head, he was the Brazilian ambassador to France and the UK. So like he's a very like he's not some crank or some fringe person. Sort of like the same thing with these OPCW whistleblowers. These are very prestigious people. And so like when they're saying these types of things, you ought to listen, I think.
Right. Well, unfortunately for most Americans, there are gatekeepers to what they will consider truth and fact, and those
Yeah.
people usually sit in very expensive news studios and run ads by Lockheed Martin and Raytheon every 15 minutes during their commercial breaks. And so maybe that has something to do with their refusal to cover this. But we don't have that problem because we have a great sponsor of the show who supports our work completely and is in no way interested in limiting what we have to say. And we wouldn't do it no matter what the sponsor said, anyways. I have to deal with that.
They're
Anyways,
also not involved in mass murder, so that's a perk of our sponsor.
right? Yeah, it's nice that they make just great medicine and not crazy weapons of mass death. But here we go, wrapping up. Will Porter is at the Will Porter. I am at Kyle Anzalone _ and the show is at con_interest. That's all on Twitter. Conflicts of Interest has a Facebook page. Make sure you check out the YouTube channel. I promise that by hopefully some point next week I'll be in what's a little bit more like a studio and have the video back to the quality it was just a couple weeks ago before I upended my life by moving across the country. And last, you could donate to the show over at patreon.com/conflicts of interest. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. See you guys.